Hello, everyone. As you're coming in, if you want to write where you're tuning in from this evening, just so we know who we have here. Um, yeah, and we'll wait for folks to come in. We're about almost halfway to where we're supposed to be. So yeah, just let us know where you're tuning in from. I have someone from Peekskill. Auburn, Alabama. We have an Auburn, Massachusetts, closer to here. Berkeley, Wethersfield. Yeah, and then we'll just wait a little bit for folks to arrive. We are almost at the number we're supposed to be. Like we have someone from Pittsfield, Montreal, East Woodstock, Mankato, Minnesota. My partner's from Minnesota, from Eveleth. Someone from Michigan, Collinsville, Dublin, Ohio. I feel like you were in another program recently. We'll, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so yes, if this is your first time here, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program, The Magi, who they were, how they've been remembered, and why they still fascinate. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. Now, let me tell you more about tonight's program. We are welcoming Eric Vanden Eykel for a discussion with Jacques Lamar about his book, The Magi. In this book, Eric explores the birth of the Magi story, its enrichments, and its artistic expressions, and its legacy in our modern culture. Our author, Eric Vanden Eykel, is an associate professor of religious studies and the Forrest S. Williams teaching chair of the Humanities at Ferrum College in Virginia. He is the author of But Their Faces Were All Looking Up, author and reader to the Protevangelium of James, and co-editor of Sex, Violence, and Early Christian Texts. He also serves as a general editor for the Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies. Our moderator, Jacques Lamar, is the Mark Twain House and Museum Special Program Coordinator, the Chief Creative Officer of Buzz Engine, and a playwright whose work can be seen currently in TheaterWorks' production of Christmas on the Rocks. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. During the event, we will also be dropping links to the book, of course, that you can purchase through our store, and donations as well, if you would be so kind to donate. And that's it for me. So please sit back and enjoy. And I'll turn this over to Eric and Jacques.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hey, hi. Are you at home or in your office?
Both. I am at
Both.
home in my office.
Are you working from home?
Currently, yes.
Currently. Okay,
Yeah, this is my little attic study that we built during COVID.
got it.
So yeah,
Are those all little Greek books back there?
the green ones are Greek and the red ones are Latin.
Uh,
So my
for
happy
light
little
reading at
a
home.
little light reading. Yeah,
Yes, they remind. I haven't told you this is a part of my bio, but I had been in the Catholic seminary for a
Mm,
year and a half over in Rome. So those
mm-hmm.
my Koine Greek never got never got very far. So my library of Greek texts is not as extensive as yours for sure. But it brought back some harrowing memories. So thank you for that.
Triggering memories, perhaps.
Triggering memories, yes.
Yes. Gotcha.
So and you're in Roanoke, correct?
Correct. Yes, Roanoke. And where are you at?
I'm in right outside of Hartford, Connecticut,
Okay.
where Mark Twain
There you go.
uh, lived and worked for 17 years. And I have to applaud you, by the way, because I'm always like picking up a book and thinking, all right, Mark Twain's not going to jump out at me at any point, and he jumps out at me on a page in this book. He's unavoidable.
That's
He
right.
was not, he was not at the Nativity, uh, but uh, it's I'm always amazed when he wends his way into a narrative somewhere.
Right. And
So,
then this one, it's pretty brief. It's about his funeral, but still, he's still there.
yes, yes. So I have to say, this is first of all, I never have this level of preparedness when it comes to talking about a book, but I felt like I needed to come in tonight with um, with my A game. So
Okay.
the this book is um, really an amazing uh, read in terms of it kind of explodes everything that you think you know about not just the Magi, but also the Nativity. And uh, before we get into the book, I just want to talk about how you got interested in your field of study
Hmm.
and when you became such a nerd. So when
Well, how much time do you have? Yeah. So my, how did I get interested in biblical studies, biblical scholarship? I mean, I've always really enjoyed reading, and I was raised as United Methodist, and we kind of grew up going to church, and I grew up, going to Bible study and reading the New Testament, and not really reading it with any sort of like huge detail, but reading it and being interested in it. And then when I got to college, I just sort of kind of by happenstance started taking courses. So my first semester of college, I took an Old Testament course, and then over the next couple of years, I took New Testament, and I took Eastern religions, Western religions, and I just found that those were the classes that were kind of keeping me up at night, and those were the classes that I was going to first to do my work, and there was just a lot of um, well, as you say, that if this book sort of makes you question a lot of what you thought you knew, those classes for me really shook my world up quite a bit and showed me that a lot of what I thought I knew wasn't actually what I thought I knew about the Bible wasn't actually there, and so I kind of started just thinking differently and more deeply about this stuff. And then, I mean, the rest is kind of just a weird story of kind of, I would say, kind of just happenstance. But after I graduated from college with a religious studies degree, it was like, well, what do you do with a religious studies degree? I don't know. I guess you could like be a minister or something. So I went to seminary, a Methodist seminary in Atlanta, and then while I was there, and continuing my studies, but also working in churches as either an intern or I did youth ministry for a little while. I realized that I did not have any interest really in working in churches. And so I talked to my advisor. I was like, so I'm having a little bit of crisis here. I've got, I'm in seminary training to be a minister, and I figured out that working in churches makes me miserable. And he says, well, it seems like you either just need to go do something else completely, or you can, go and do a PhD or something. And so I was like, oh, PhD sounds fun. Yeah, and then the rest is just sort of I continued just down that path of nerddom, and now here I am, like just with all these books behind me here. So yeah.
Now, not I was raised in the Roman Catholic faith, and I think a lot of Roman Catholics don't actually read the Bible because it's read to us on Sundays, and it's not something that that's, I don't want to say it's not encouraged, but it's not part of the faith tradition the way that it is with certain Protestant elements. No one's forbidden to do it, obviously, but it's they'd rather have you read like Vatican II documents or something like that. So,
or go to mass. I mean, just go to
mass.
mass and do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, when you're in the seminary, we had to read the breviary, do the hours and whatnot. But it's all little bite sizes and what have you. With the Methodist tradition is biblical literalism, because we are going to get to the Magi, and this is kind of important, in terms of current faith traditions. What's the in the Methodist tradition, at how much are you expected to take the Bible or biblical text at face value?
Well, that depends on the Methodist that you ask. That's very much, I think, it depends on who you're asking, and maybe even what mood they're in. And also, very, very importantly, it depends on what you're asking them about. So Methodists tend to be, in my experience, pretty reasonable, and the official teaching of the Methodist Church, and I'm not, everyone keeping in mind that I'm not a very good Methodist, but the official teaching of the Methodist Church is that when you're doing theological reflection and these sorts of things, the Bible is an important data point in theological reflection. But there's also other data points. There's a data point of tradition, the data point of reason, and also experience. And so these four things, and this is what's known to Methodists as the Wesleyan quadrilateral of scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. I like to think of these things almost as like fence posts. You sort of make your fence, you figure out what the fence posts look like, and then you can talk about what's going on in the fence, whether that be a point of theology or Christology or morality or any of these other things. So I would say that most Methodists I know I would not describe them as biblical literists. I would describe them as thoughtful readers of ancient texts, and this doesn't mean that I agree with them on all their interpretations, but thoughtful readers of ancient texts. Methodists are technically evangelical, which means that they do consider the New Testament and Old Testament to be in some way valuable for contemporary reflection on things like faith and morals and those sorts of things. But again, most Methodists that I know I would consider very thoughtful and not literalists in any sense.
Yeah. So you mentioned your PhD, which congratulations.
Thanks.
And it's a jumping off point for your book, in terms of how you actually got started on the Magi. So if you want to tell that story quickly.
Sure. Yeah. So after I defended my dissertation in spring of 2014, we had this conversation over dinner with my dissertation committee. And one of the things that dissertation committees like to do, they usually do this in the defense, in the dissertation defense itself, is they like to ask you, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do the way that I would have done it, or whatever. But a member of my committee asked me, why didn't you discuss the Magi in the Magi episode at the end of the text that I studied, the Proto-Gospel of James? And I said, well, they weren't really all that valuable, but, I said, it might be kind of fun to write something about them, a book or something like that in the future. And so anyway, in sort of like almost like a muscle memory, graduate students have a muscle memory that kind of leads them to the library. And so the next week, after I had defended my dissertation and I had literally nothing to work on, I was still in the library and I was sitting in my research carrel going, oh my gosh, I don't have to use any of these books anymore. So I took them back and I started getting commentaries down from the shelves on Matthew. And I was sitting there just looking at all of them. And I had this experience where I was really just finding basically the same answer over and over again when I looked at the Magi story, and I found the answer that I encountered to be extremely boring and just not very satisfying. And so, but I then, after I kind of went through and recorded what all these commentaries had said, I then just went online and started looking in every single dark corner of the internet that I could. And I was finding like spells of the Magi and necromancy, and I was finding Knights Templar and UFO theories and all this kind of stuff. And so I was looking at this going, oh yeah, there's a book that needs to be written here, somewhere between the boring scholarly consensus on who the Magi were and then the nutty, like they were following a UFO. There's a middle path to be found there. And so that's kind of what's the motivating factor.
And in reading your book, it's pretty clear that there actually, to a certain extent, isn't a scholarly consensus to a degree, because there's so much mystery surrounding the Magi, and it doesn't take very long for you to start blowing my mind and making me want to chuck my nativity scene out the window. So we're gonna
don't do it. Don't get rid of it. Don't get rid of it.
But let's now, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with the structure of the New Testament, the bulk of it are the Gospels, and there are the Synoptic Gospels, and there's John's Gospel,
right?
But of the four, the Magi only appear in one.
Correct. So, they appear at the start of Matthew and in 12 verses in the second chapter. And then they're gone. They're never mentioned again. There's never any reference to them to say, oh, and Jesus had Magi come to him at his birth. So yeah, they appear only in Matthew, and they're very, very briefly.
Yes, and so it's pretty amazing that this incredible tradition has sprung out of these 12 lines of these characters, I'm trying to decide what's the first question here regarding your studies, because I think you talk about the need to. I'll have you talk about the need to approach them through the eyes of who would have been reading this or receiving this information.
Right. Yeah. So. Yeah. So when one of the things that and this is something that biblical scholars do. This is one of our things, is to say, any ancient text, really any text, it's really, really important to understand that text. I don't like the expression on its own terms, but in its original context, so far as we can determine what that context was. And so some biblical scholars frame this as, we need to find out what the author meant. We need to find out what the author meant when he or she wrote, whatever they wrote. I'm more of the position where I think that we need to ask how this, I think we need to ask the question of authorship and readership at the same time. And so to take a text like Matthew, which we think was written, maybe in the 80s of the first century, to say, okay, so let's take away all of these kind of categories that we've used to talk about the Magi and to talk about, astrology and whatever, and really just strip as much away as we can from the story and say, okay, what might Matthew be up to here? What could he be up to? Like, what's not what is he definitely up to, but what is potentially he up to? And then what interpretations are possible from the perspective of, let's say, a sincere, educated first century reader who is reading this text or even hearing this text, right? So if we're talking about ancient texts, we're not always talking about people who have, bookshelves filled with books. We sometimes are talking about texts that are performed or that are heard, by those sorts of folks. And so, so my goal in the first part of the book is to say, let's try to forget everything. Let's try to forget that nativity, right? Don't throw it away, but let's try to forget that it exists for a little while. And
Yeah.
and then let's maybe see, okay, let's go back to Matthew and see what's there and see what's not there. And then kind of start to formulate a hypothesis on what might be going on with the story, what's possible.
And what's interesting is in those 12 lines, the basic information of what we know is there. But when you strip away centuries of tradition and storytelling and lore and art and different interpretations, artistic interpretations or what have you, there's, to a certain extent, a lot there and not a lot there. And so I think the basic thing that we need to start with is, all right, we've heard them called the three kings. We've heard them called the wise men. We've heard them called Magi. First of all, we don't know how many of them there were, correct?
Correct. Yeah, Matthew. So that's a biblical scholars really like to in the classroom upset their students by pointing out the things that we assume are in the text, but that aren't actually. And this is one of the more fun things to kind of point out is that Matthew doesn't actually say three magi came to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Matthew says Magi came to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and that they brought three gifts. And is Matthew actually imagining that there was three of them? I mean, yeah, probably. I think that's probably what he's up to. But if we think about this in terms of events that you bring things to, like let's say a baby shower, people come to baby showers bringing pretty common gifts, right? You could have 30 people come to a baby shower, and all of them could bring diapers, wipes, and toys or whatever. And so three gifts, but a lot more people.
Yes. So, all right. So that's first, it may not be three.
Right.
Now, let's talk about the word magi.
Okay.
And you spend the better part of 2 chapters kind of analyzing, what the term, is it Magoi? In Greek,
Magoi, Magoi, all of those are acceptable. Yeah.
Got it. So let's talk about that word.
Yeah. So one of the kind of scholarly positions when you survey the literature is that Matthew considers these characters to be Gentiles, and that's the Gentiles are coming to worship Jesus, and it's foreshadowing that Christianity would become a Gentile movement. And I think that it is so surface and so boring, and also it just doesn't help us to make sense of why Matthew chose this word magoi. So the word magoi in the ancient world is extremely, extremely loaded. And so this is like this as far from a neutral term as you can get. So let me give you an example. So in terms of like how we refer to people and what a difference it does make. So I could tell you a story of, I get up in the morning and, let me just tell you the story. I'm gonna tell you the same story, but I'm going to tell you it 2 different ways using just a different title. So once upon a time, I got up out of bed and I went to my window and I looked out, and there was a man standing on the sidewalk in front of my house. He looked toward the house and he walked towards the door. Okay, so that's one way of starting the story. There's a man on my sidewalk walking up to my house. Now, the second way of starting the story is to say, I got up, looked out the window, and there was a lawyer standing on the sidewalk. And he looked at my house and he started walking towards the door. Okay, well, there you have my attention, because that could be good news or that could be really bad news. That lawyer may be coming to tell me that I've got a rich uncle that I never knew about, which would be great. Or that lawyer could be coming to tell me that the bank is repossessing my house, right? So when we use the word lawyer, right, that is a loaded term. And are lawyers good or bad people? Well, it very much depends on which lawyer you're talking to, and more importantly, your relationship to them. If they're on your side, they're a positive figure, and if they're not, then they're a negative figure, right?
Yes.
So lawyer is one of those really, really loaded terms. And when Matthew says that Magoi came to Jerusalem, I mean, this is the same kind of thing. So there are only two other characters in the entire New Testament who are called Magi, and they're both none of them in Matthew, but they're both in the book of Acts, which is right after the four Gospels. And in the book of Acts, both of these characters are negative. They are, one of them is a charlatan, like a street performer almost, named Simon, and he kind of amazes the crowds with his tricks. And he's described as having performed magic before or something like this. But then he gets himself in trouble because he sees Jesus's apostles laying on hands and giving people the Holy Spirit. And he comes up to Peter and he says, how much do I have to pay you for this power? And Peter kind of curses him and he leaves and he's like, oh my God, whatever. But he's a negative character. And then the other example is a person on the island of Cyprus called Bar-Jesus, who is described as a magus and also a Jewish false prophet. And he tries to keep Paul and Barnabas from preaching on Cyprus, and Paul strikes him blind, and he leaves the narrative blind. So extremely negative with these characters. But then there's also examples outside of the New Testament where Magi are positive figures. They are advisory figures to kings. In Herodotus, they are people who, if you've got a problem, if you've got if you have a vision or if you have a dream or anything like this, who are you going to call? You're going to call the Magi. And so in those texts, they are admirable. They are trained religious professionals who can do things, who have certain abilities of finding significance in things like visions or dreams or stars. And so, so that word, though, when English translations render it as astrologers, it's not helpful, because Magi are able to see significance in things like stars, but that's not all that they do. Rendering it as wise men is probably even worse, right? It's just very, very neutral, and it kind of it frames them as sort of like philosophers or something like this. For Matthew, in that first century context, these are religious figures, and they are highly trained. And for Matthew, he seems to settle on that side of they're also positive. He doesn't seem to suggest that they're negative figures at all.
Got it. So at your next holiday cocktail party, if someone calls them the kings or wise men,
yeah,
we can correct them and say they're Magi.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is with kings, of all of the ways that Magi gets translated, one of the only things that it absolutely doesn't really mean is king. That's one of the only that, I mean, but the king bit comes, it comes early in the tradition as you have these figures who are coming to pay tribute to the king of the Judeans, and then they become kings themselves, sort of in the imagination of early Christians. But yeah, Magi definitely does not mean king.
All right, so you actually kind of jumped my next thing that I wanted to ask about,
Okay.
which is we all think that they are there to how does it say they come to worship, or they come to honor?
So the verb that Matthew uses is a Greek verb proskuneo, and it is usually the usual default translation for proskuneo is worship. It just means to bow one's face towards the ground. And I translated into this book as to honor. So they want to come and honor him rather than worship him, because I'm not convinced that Matthew imagines the Magi as worshiping Jesus. I think that he has them coming to pay tribute and to acknowledge him as the new king.
Yeah, and just to let you all know, there's barely a word in these 12 lines that does not get scrutiny here. And so the interesting thing is your choice of word of who they have come to honor. And how you choose to interpret that word. So why don't we talk about whether or not he's the king of the Jews or the king of the Judeans?
Right. And that's an important point here. So this is a pretty important and prominent debate among some in biblical studies and it all comes down to this word in Greek, the eudaioi. And eudaioi is it is translated most often as in this story as King of the Jews. But eudaioi, what does eudaioi mean? Well, eudaioi means eudaioi, but how do we render it into English? And that's the big debate. So on one side of the debate, and I'll also preface this for any biblical scholars who are here, I'm not going to solve this debate tonight. I'm just going to tell you where I stand on it. So on the one side of the debate, there is a group that says we should be translating eudaioi as Judeans all the time, regardless. And so when you see eudaioi, translated as Judeans, meaning people who live in Judea and also have an ethnic tie or have an ethnic tie to Judea. And the reasoning here is complicated, but really to kind of at the most basic level, the reasoning is, well, when we talk about groups of people in the ancient world, we talk about them based on their geographical locations or the places that they're tied to. So if you ask somebody, who's from Egypt, who are you, or what are you? They'll be like, oh, I'm an Egyptian, I'm a Babylonian, I'm a Roman, it's geographical, and so it stands to reason. Then, if you're dealing with a word that literally means Judean, then you should just translate it as signaling that portion of land, right? Even Judeans who were living in Egypt, which there are plenty of Judeans living in Egypt, they are still Judeans, sort of in terms of their ethnos, their designation.
You make an interesting distinction about classifying groups by religion, if you can talk about that. Well, our understanding in a modern sense is different than it would have necessarily been understood by readers in the first century.
Right. So ancient readers, we don't really have that concept of just religion as a sort of, I'm a this or I'm a that in terms of a religious designation, quite as much as we do today. But the ethnos, when you're talking about people's ethnos in the ancient world, that presumes a whole constellation of different identity markers. So, assumptions about the nature of the world, things that we would think about as religious practices and those sorts of things. And so, to be an Egyptian is to assume certain things about everything, and also to kind of, it is to be a unique person, a member of this ethnos. And the same is true for being a Judean. So that's the sort of one side of that debate. On the other side of that debate, and if we're doing this as sort of a polar opposite, whatever, the other side of that debate is anytime you see eudaioi, it should almost always be translated as Jews. And and I'm actually, I'll say very, very clearly, I am fine actually with either of these things, either of these translations. I don't consider Jews to be a wrong translation of eudaioi. I consider Judeans in this story to be a better translation for what Matthew's after. But I think there are plenty of instances where I would say translating it as Jews rather than Judeans would be appropriate.
I think one of the interesting things about a thesis that you have is when they appear before Herod. Mm-hmm. And we'll get to the lead-in to Herod the Star a little bit later, but the choice of word becomes important when they talk to Herod about who they've come to see.
Right.
And there's a certain dimension to it, a political dimension to it, mm-hmm. That I think would have skated by a lot of us. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So the question, they only have one line of dialogue in the entire story, and that is when they get to Jerusalem and they say, where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? And they say, we saw his star at its rising, and we've come to honor him. I think that's roughly what the translation is. So, so this question though, if we have, where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? I argue that it's extremely important to see not only the phrasing of that question, the one who has been born in this role, but also Herod's response to it, because Herod doesn't say that's me. Herod says, where's the one born King of the Judeans? Let me get my advisors and see where he's supposed to be from. Because Herod is sort of in this, Matthew has Herod in this story more or less saying, well, if you're looking for the one born King of the Judeans, that ain't me. And so when you look at that kind of political situation in the first century, one of the things that you discover is that Herod's official title is King of the Judeans. But there's a difficulty here because we know from a Jewish historian, Josephus, that Herod's title doesn't come to him by nature of his birth. Herod's title is given to him by the Roman Senate. And so the Roman Senate votes for Herod to be the king of the Judeans, the ruler of this particular region. But Herod doesn't have that right by birth. And also there's a kind of a little bit of a problem here because Herod is himself not a Judean. Herod is an Idumean. And so I think that what Matthew is doing, or one of the things Matthew is doing, is casting a bit of shade on Herod and saying, you might have this title, but it's not a proper title for you. Rome is the one that gave it to you. And but where's the one born King of the Judeans? And they're looking for Jesus, who Matthew has already set up through his genealogy as somebody who's in the lineage of former Judean kings. And so the reader is saying, well, that's Jesus.
Now, Matthew kicks off his gospel by placing Jesus in a certain context, historical context, which lends I'm sorry, my cat is being particularly aggressive.
That's okay.
He is put, I just don't want him to turn my computer off. Talk about the Davidic lineage and why that's important and how that plays into the politics.
Yeah. So Matthew is Matthew's gospel starts in a really, really strange way with the genealogy, and basically just a big list of names that starts with Abraham and it ends with Jesus. And when I teach Matthew's gospel in class, I always start with the first day by asking the students, raise your hand if you skip the genealogy. So and so begat so and so begat so and so, and nobody really wants to admit at first that they've skipped the genealogy. Some people who are here as participants right now might be like, yeah, I've never read the genealogy either. I don't blame you. Genealogies aren't really riveting things to read, but Matthew's is really important. And luckily, because Matthew is not really a subtle author, he tells you exactly why he's telling the genealogy, why he's listing the things the way that he lists them. So he tells you that the genealogy is divided into 3 groups of 14 generations each. And in the middle generation is the one that's really, really important for our purposes. But this number 14 for Matthew and his first century readers is really, really important too, because the number 14, there's a practice in the ancient world called gematria. So ancient alphabets don't really have, the Hebrew alphabet, the Greek alphabet, and Roman numerals, whatever, don't really have special characters for numbers. And so the letters have numerical values. And so if you take David's name written out in Hebrew and you add the numerical value of his name, you get the number 14. And this is pretty well known. And so Matthew is setting this up and saying, there's 3 generations, 14. He's like almost shaking his readers, like, are you paying attention? 14 generations. David is the 14th person in the genealogy. And Matthew is hammering all of this home. David, David, David. And then if that's not all enough, he's also saying, also Jesus is born in Bethlehem, which is the city of David. And so that's really, really important, Jesus's Davidic heritage for Matthew. And I think that primes the pump And then when the Magi show up asking about the one born king of the Judeans, the reader's is like, well, yeah, obviously that's Jesus because he's a descendant of David.
So Omar was asking at the in the green room this question. Now there's some timeline issues that we experience when looking at what we know of history and what we know of Jesus. Now, technically, Herod had died in 4 BCE, correct?
Correct.
And so he wouldn't have necessarily been around when this story is told, but there is some potential fluidity as to what year Christ was born, correct?
Right. We have no idea when Jesus was born.
Yes. And so for people who are smart alecky at dinner parties and whatnot and say, well, December 25th wasn't really his birthday. How do we get it December 25th?
Yeah. So yeah, we don't know. There's been I read on occasion. And it always kind of comes out at this time of year. There's some pieces that'll come out and Jesus couldn't have been born in the winter because the shepherds were out to pasture and and all of these things. So one of the things, the way that I tend to approach the question of when, why December 25th, right? Why is that important? Well, early Christians were far more concerned in the earliest kind of period with the conception day of Jesus, which also is the traditional death day of Jesus. And so, March 25th tends to be sort of the date that arises as the day of Jesus's conception or the incarnation or whatever, and then also the death, because Jesus is, an important person who dies on the same day that he was conceived. And then what happens then after that is that the rest of the dates kind of get filled in. So if March 25th is Jesus's conception date, then December 25th, roughly 9 months later, or exactly 9 months later, must be the birth. And so, but one of the things that I like to kind of remind people of is when we're dealing with these dates, when we're dealing especially with the date of, December 25th, December 25th isn't Jesus's birthday. December 25th is the day that Christians commemorate the birth of Jesus. And so, a couple of examples, our dog is, we have no idea when she was born because we got her from the kennel or whatever. And so they're like, I don't know, she's about a year old. But we don't know when she's born because somebody found her. And so we adopted her on July 25th. And so we decided that was her birthday. Another example, which is people are going to think is crazy and they're going to go look it up, but I promise I'm telling the truth. Horses are another example of their birth certificates don't have their actual birthday on them. They have a date that was chosen for another purpose. So every horse born in the Northern Hemisphere is on paper born on January 1st. And every single horse born in the Southern Hemisphere is on paper as being born on August 1st. Now, that doesn't mean they were born on January 1st and August 1st. Those dates were chosen to help with, age-related horse racing, these sorts of things. But those kind of that's practiced among thoroughbred horses. So December 25th is the date that Jesus's birth is commemorated, but we have no idea when it actually happened.
Got it. We are getting close to when I need to go to Q&A, but there's so much that I still haven't hit yet. So I'm going to try and horse race through.
Okay.
With no set date for when this horse is born.
Okay.
We're going to try and horse race through some things. First of all, slaughter of the innocents. Herod killing all the children under the age of 2. Did it happen?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. Let's talk about the star. And I know it's hard because you spend quite a bit of time on the star. Oop, sorry, my cat again. The star gets interpreted in a number of different ways, but one of the things that you spend some time on is astronomical, is that the right term? Incidents or things that are, I always think of astronomical like prices, but
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Astrological or
ast- yeah,
astronomical events. Yeah. Yeah.
yes. So let's talk about some of the things, because I don't even know how you found those dates and years and whatnot, but let's talk about some of the things that that the star could have been
hmm
in terms of a natural event.
Yeah.
And we can talk about the supernatural interpretation of the star.
Yeah, so the natural event is the one that everyone's always very interested in. 2 years ago, there was a planetary conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that everyone was really, really excited about. And there was, I wrote a piece for the conversation about whether this was the Star of Bethlehem making a comeback. Spoiler, if you don't want to read it, I said no, because but these sorts of things, right? A planetary conjunction, right? Two planets coming together and becoming brighter. Could this have been, what Matthew was thinking about? People have suggested a comet, and I'm going to just fully admit the dates are a bit fuzzy in my brain. I've never been very good with numbers, so I'm not going to look them up. But around the turn of that millennium, there was Halley's comet passed by, I think around 10 BCE. I think that's
Mhm.
right. And there's other planetary conjunctions that happen around that kind of time period. And so is it the case? The big question for people is when Matthew says that the Magi saw something, right? They saw
Mhm.
a star, an aster. Was Matthew thinking about something specific, something big that his readers would recognize and go, oh, that's what that was, right? And really, my position is I don't think Matthew is thinking of a specific astronomical event. I think that Matthew believes that important leaders are symbolized by stars rising, and that people's stars rise when they come to power, and then they fall when they leave from power. And so, but also I think that if Matthew is talking about an identifiable astronomical event, we're not
Mhm.
going to be able to figure out what that was because he doesn't give us any detail. The star that he's talking about doesn't behave like a normal star, and because we don't know the year of Jesus's birth, we have no way of knowing. Sort of what was happening in that kind of time period. But I think that that's missing the point of Matthew's story too.
Got it. Now, the gifts. The gifts are one of the few things where he does give a little detail,
hmm
um, and actually names them, although you think the interpretation of one of the names may be a little bit off. So let's talk about gold, frankincense, or incense and myrrh.
Yeah, I just say gold, incense, and myrrh, just to kind of as part of the project of defamiliarizing the Magi story. So the incense, frankincense is just incense from the frankincense tree. So it's sort of potato. But no, there's a lot of interpretations, early interpretations of these gifts as having symbolic significance, as the gold symbolizing Jesus's kingship, the incense symbolizing Jesus's divinity, and then the myrrh symbolizing his death and humanity. I sort of take a position in this book where I don't think that Matthew has any of those on his radar. I think
Mhm.
that the primary significance of these gifts for him is that they're expensive. And so he may well be alluding to some kind of tradition or some passage that is out there, but I think his main point is, okay, let me think of the most expensive things that I can come up with, right? And I think those are three pretty expensive things in the ancient world.
Sure. Because I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. We're going to skip over a number of things that really are going to require people to do something, and that is get your book, because there's so much more to unpack that we haven't been able to. Um, Determining where they were from. I mean, we have come into stories of them being from Arabia, from Persia. Later, they're given names.
Right.
Actually, why don't you talk about Balthazar, Caspar, Gaspar,
hmm
and Melchior, and where those names may have come from, because they don't
Yeah,
come
so
from the Bible.
no, they don't. Well, Balthazar does, because Daniel's name in the Greek version of Daniel is he becomes known as Balthazar. So there might be a link there where these kind of names start to align with those traditions. It's something I'm thinking about. I don't really get into much discussion about the names in the book, but no, the names sort of they sort of start to emerge. It seems like around the 6th century, so the naming is pretty early, and I think there's a sense that when we're thinking about the characters of the Magi, they do become very popular figures in the early Christian imagination, early and later Christian imagination, and and so I think as people continue to think about them, we are uncomfortable with people just being sort of nameless. And so there's a sense that we need to kind of, figure out who these people actually were. And part of that is also figuring out not only where they're from, but yeah, what they were called. And so no, we get the names in a pretty early, I think, 6th century Latin text. And then also they are named. There's a mosaic in a beautiful church in Ravenna in Italy, where they have their names and also designation saint above them, and as they're bringing the gifts to Jesus, and they're all named there.
And that's the one that has the comet that in that painting. Is that the one you're talking about? Or
No, though, no, that is that's the Scrivini Chapel in Padua, and that has the when Giotto in early 1300s painted what we think is Halley's Comet as the Star of Bethlehem, because Halley's Comet would have passed by sometime close to the birth of Jesus, and Giotto saw it 5 or 6 years before he painted the Scrivini Chapel.
And of course, Mark Twain's synchronicity. He was born the year that Halley's Comet was in the sky, and predicted he would go out with Halley's Comet, which he did.
Wild.
Exactly.
It all comes back to Mark Twain, as they say.
Exactly. So right before I dive into the questions that we have from the audience, and just a reminder, I saw some questions going into the chat, but if you could make sure to drop into the Q&A, so it'll be a little easier for me to locate, that would be much appreciated. So, I started by asking about biblical literalism. Now you talk about them as characters. We look at, obviously Jesus as a historic figure, Herod a historic figure, but are we looking at the Magi as a literary device that Matthew employs, or were there actual Magi, that came to honor the baby Jesus?
Yeah, that's a really important question for a lot of people, and I think that probably I think a lot of people who are going to pick up this book are interested in that question. So my position in this book is really that it doesn't matter whether they were historical or not, and the reason is for our understanding of this story, right? It doesn't really matter if there were real Magi. I'm somebody who deals with just sort of evidence. And so if you ask me, did Magi come from the east to Jerusalem and Bethlehem? I mean, if I have to choose an answer, my answer is going to be probably not. But I also am going to acknowledge, I don't know how you would go about proving that they did. I also don't know how you would go about proving that they didn't. And so for my purposes, let's focus on the text that we have in front of us, which we do know that actually exists. And so the question of that sort of historicity is, I think, an important one for many people. For the purposes of this book, though, I am treating them as literary devices, as fictional characters in the Gospel of Matthew. But, and you can maybe either agree or disagree with this, I don't think, I mean, I've actually talked with a couple people who do very firmly believe that the Magi were historical figures, and they have read this book and said, yeah, this is great. I mean, I disagree that they're not historical figures, but I don't disagree with anything you said about them. So really the focus of the book is not on proving or disproving that they existed. The focus of the book is saying, let's focus on what we have available to us, which is Matthew and the way that Matthew's been read.
Now, there's one thing that we Catholics, or at least Catholics in good standing, love is a relic.
Mm,
And there are relics of the three kings, or relics that are believed to be the remains of the three kings.
right.
You want to talk about that real quick, and I will
I
then hop into the questions.
I do. Now, this is a place that I have and now officially written about, and I think I wrote about convincingly enough to say that maybe I, wrote about it while I was looking at this thing. But there's a giant. I've not actually been to this location yet. I was going to go in the summer of 2020, and we all remember how that turned out. So we were a world health risk, so no travel. But in Cologne, in Germany, there is a giant triple sarcophagus in the Cathedral Church of St. Peter, and this triple sarcophagus was built in the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century to house what were believed to be the bones of the Magi, and they are still there today. They have there's at least one firsthand account of somebody watching the box be opened and the remains taken out in the 1800s, and they wrote about how the bones were reassembled, and seems like three pretty complete adults that are in this box. But as with all relics, whose bones are they actually? We are not really sure, but it is a extremely popular pilgrimage site where and the coat of arms in Cologne has three crowns on it, the symbols of these Magi. But they were brought to Cologne by Frederick Barbarossa in the year is escaping me right now, when Milan was sacked, and they had been in Milan before that, and then before that they had been in Constantinople. So they had these, whosever bones these were, or are, I guess, they had a very a series of adventures to end up in Germany.
Right. All right. Fred Fletcher asks, Acts written by Luke, Matthew written by Matthew. Possible different intended meaning of the word magoi?
Absolutely. Matthew, so far as we can tell, Matthew doesn't have a problem with magoi, because if he did, he wouldn't have them coming to see Jesus. But Luke is one of these people. So yes, Acts is written likely by Luke, or by somebody who likes Luke and is writing it as an homage. We're not really sure. Everyone has an opinion, but no, the author of Luke really doesn't like magoi, or anything dealing with magic or anything like that. So and English translations pick up on this with the story of Bar Jesus in Acts 13. He's called a magician, and it's the same word. So if you can imagine your English translation saying, in Matthew, the magicians from the east came to Jerusalem, right? A very different way of framing that. But yeah, two very different opinions on what magoi are.
Great question, Fred. Charles Woolsey asks, do any of the unbiblical gospels mention magoi? What is the consensus understanding on the star that they saw? Is there any historical writing on the murder of children in Bethlehem? That's a triple question, Charles. All right, well, I think that we already answered the last one regarding the slaughter of the innocents. And there was another question in the chat about why isn't the killing of the 2-year-old boys by Herod talked about during Christmas time? Because it's not festive. That was a question to John.
It's a huge buzzkill, right?
It's a huge buzzkill.
Yeah.
Especially when you have toddlers.
Yeah.
But and we talked about what's the consensus understanding of the star that they saw, and there really isn't a consensus, correct?
Correct. But the non-canonical gospels are filled with stories about the magoi and about Matthew's magoi in particular. So one of the chapters in this book deals with an assortment of those stories. There's a really crazy one called the Revelation of the Magi, which is a long text that details the adventures of the Magi from their point of view. And so it's the revelation of the Magi is as long as the entire Gospel of Matthew. And they talk about what they're seeing, and they talk about following the star and why they're seeking Jesus and all of that. So so yes, lots and lots of non-canonical stories about the Magi.
Yeah, and as Eric mentioned, he does go into, I think, 4 or 5 examples from apocryphal texts, and also how the Magi are viewed in patristic texts.
Right.
So again, we had to in the interest of not having this conversation be 3 hours long. So
It could easily be.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Please pick up the book to get more of that information.
Mhm.
Charles also asked, do we know what year Christ died?
That's an easy one. No, we don't. Yeah.
And do we know that he died at age 33, or is that just kind of the part of the popular lore as well?
That's a popular lore, and just sort of a one idiosyncratic way of kind of connecting the dots and a couple of different references to feasts and whatever in Gospels. But yeah, I mean, he could have been in his 20s, could have been in his 30s. We're not really sure.
Got it.
Yeah.
Now, Mary Dissette asks, what is the connection with January 6th Feast of the Epiphany with
Yeah.
the Magi?
So the
Or the
Epiphany
Feast
is
of the Three Kings, which we're not going to call it that anymore.
never. We're not going to. No, that's
Right,
not. It's not. It's not allowed anymore. Yeah. So Epiphany is. I mean, Epiphany is the Magi holiday, and so the Feast of the Epiphany celebrates the day that the Magi reach Bethlehem, and I think. And so the Epiphany ends the Christmas season. It's the end of the 12 days of Christmas, and so I like to think, as a guy who thinks a lot about the Magi, I like to think about Christmas as the minor holiday that inaugurates the season of Epiphany. That's just my own opinion, but that's how I'm celebrating it this year.
Got it.
Yeah.
And actually, jumping over to a question from Jonathan in the chat, saying, question for me, don't Catholics have the Massacre of Innocents feast on December 28th? And I, being a very shaky Catholic at best, had to Google it. Yes, January 28th is the feast day. It's not necessarily a day that's celebrated, but this sounds like it's a little bit like Saint Christopher now, where it didn't really happen. We're commemorating a massacre that isn't historically accurate.
Yeah.
All right, next question. This one is another one from Fred. If Magi are a literary device, what do you think is Matthew's intent for writing their story? Which is a great question.
I think it's a fantastic question. So I think that just to restate, I think that the point of the Magi story, or at least a potential point of the Magi story, is to legitimize the kingship of Jesus, and to say, Jesus is the rightful king of the Judeans, and to say Herod is not. And I think that Matthew is writing during a time where the world is a bit in turmoil. And so Matthew perhaps is even writing a critique of the Roman Empire, because the only other time, as I mentioned, Jesus as king of the Judeans in the Magi story, the only other time where that title appears in Matthew is at the death of Jesus, when the soldiers mock Jesus and put the robe on him and crown him, which is sort of a mock coronation, and they say, "Hail, King of the Judeans," and then Pontius Pilate puts the title King of the Judeans above his head on the cross. And so so I do think that that Matthew's point in the story is very political, and I think that Matthew and his readers are sort of imagining that when Magi show up, what this means is potentially bad news for whoever is in power at the time, right? So when you have Magi in ancient literature show up, they're there in the courts of kings to be advisory figures, but oftentimes they're also there, and kings then cease to be kings. And so so I think Matthew's point is very much to sort of point out those different kingships.
Yeah. Omar, if you can just pop into the chat, let us know if we can go a little bit over. I don't want to hold you hostage this evening. I will keep plowing ahead here on. Oh, there he is.
Yes, it's totally fine. This is a great program. Let's keep going.
Okay.
Stephanie asks, and this has been answered, but she missed it because her dogs were being naughty.
Stephanie.
When did the Magi first get their names? And you said in the 6th century is about when it started to.
6th century is, yeah, I think that would my guess is probably the 6th century seems to be where the names start to appear in texts as well as in the mosaics and things of that nature. And so that could either indicate a 6th century origin, or that could indicate that those names had already been known in terms of oral tradition or whatever for a little while before then. But no, 6th century, 5th, 6th century would be my guess.
Got it. Now, last 3 questions. One is from William, who says, one tradition has the men coming from Ethiopia, Spain, and Yemen. What is the story behind assigning these nations to the men? But I've seen India, Persia, Arabia, what have you.
Yeah.
I don't know if William's questions are specific to Ethiopia, Spain, and Yemen, but why did we start seeing countries associated when it's not clear, other than they're from the East?
Right. Well, and I think it's, and I'm not sure that I've seen Spain before, and that's actually not to say that's incorrect. I might, something might be slipping my mind, or there's plenty out there that I still need to look at. The tradition of them coming from different locations and sort of converging in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Mm-hmm. This seems to be a pretty old tradition. And I think that it seems to be linked very much to this idea that the Magi are supposed to be understood first and foremost as Gentiles, as non-Jews who are, who are sort of foreshadowing the trajectory that Christianity becomes or gets on, which is to say that, it becomes a predominantly Gentile movement. And so the idea there is that they are, the entire inhabited world, as the people who are talking about these places understand it, the entire inhabited world is coming together to sort of come and worship Jesus. So I've seen, Ethiopia, India, and Persia, and all these sorts of places. But I think that's what's going on there.
Dr. Wesley Brown asks, why don't you hold to historicity of slaughter of the innocents, your rationale?
So my rationale is that, as a person who's looking at, first and foremost at ancient literature, one of the things that I'm most interested in is the function that things are serving within the narrative. And so if something serves a very, very clear function to the broader point that the author is trying to make in the narrative, then I often assume that detail or that story has been created or crafted or molded by that author. And so in the case of Matthew's slaughter of the innocents, the function that serves in Matthew, well, it serves 2 functions. The first function is that it helps Matthew to portray Herod as a figure that's similar to Pharaoh, because one of the things that Matthew's really, really interested in is convincing his readers not only that Jesus is a Davidic type of figure, but also that he's a Mosaic type of figure, someone similar to Moses. And so the story of the slaughter of the innocents, this is very, very clearly an homage to the story in Exodus, where the Pharaoh is, like Herod, afraid of losing power. And so he solves this problem by thinning his slave population by killing all of the babies. And then Moses is miraculously saved from this. And all of this takes place in Egypt, where, oh my gosh, that's where Jesus and his family go. And then they come out of Egypt and whatever. So that story sort of, in my mind, serves as a very convenient way for Matthew to get Jesus from Bethlehem to Nazareth, but then also to make Herod into a Pharaoh figure.
Got it.
And yeah.
And I'm the last question from William, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, Marit or Marut, um, is a huge question in
Mhm.
a certain sense. Um, and I think the way that it's posed really could apply to any aspect of the Bible.
Mhm.
It says, if one thing in Matthew is of dubious veracity, doesn't that make everything in Matthew of dubious veracity? But we're not talking
Yeah.
about necessarily veracity, but let's talk about, I'll let you go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, and so I think by veracity, I think what's meant by that is historical reliability. I think, and if that is not correct, please throw another question in there. But I think that's what's meant by that. So on the one hand, I think that yes, absolutely, and as a scholar of these texts, one of the things that I do is I question everything about them, and so there's certainly some things in Matthew that I consider to be historically reliable. Those things are pretty few and far between, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that Matthew contains some historical nuggets. Jesus was a historical figure. There's plenty of evidence outside the New Testament for that. Jesus was crucified by the Romans. There's plenty of evidence outside of the New Testament for that, textual evidence. But no, I don't think that it's a good way to frame it to say if one thing is not historically accurate, if we start questioning this, doesn't everything else fall into that trap as well? I think that's the slippery slope argument, and I don't think that it's a good argument. But I think that it is important when we are looking at these texts. I think that it's important to sort of move away from this question of historical accuracy and to start asking the question of meaning, because again, that's what we have access to. And I think also that sort of gets us closer to the way that ancient authors were thinking about these texts. And so I think that if you interrogated Matthew and you said, listen, were the Magi real people? I'm sure Matthew probably had an opinion on it, but I think he would probably tell you that you were missing the point. I mean, I don't think the point is who were they actually. I think the point is the function that they serve.
Yeah. And I mean, when you look at the term, evangelization, or that the purpose of these books were to bring people closer to Jesus and his message. And so if the text isn't necessarily playing fast and loose, I mean, they're books of faith. They're not history books per se, correct? Or
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that well, and you're stepping on an enormous hornet's nest that I'm going to
oh,
yank you away from real quick.
all right, quick.
Say,
All right.
let's not go there. But no, I mean, that's the whole question of why the people that wrote these texts, why did they write them? There was for a long time, and I'm sure it's still prominent in some circles, this idea that that these texts were written to teach people about, if you need to know the story of Jesus, read this text. Nobody's reading the Gospels who doesn't already know how the story ends. I mean, people are reading the Gospels because they already are worshiping Jesus, or however we want to phrase that. But I think that there is a sense that these are for, the building up of people's beliefs or communal practice or things like this. They were not written just as and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. These authors weren't interested in straight history the way that we think about history today.
Got it. And there's obviously factoring in the fact that many people believe that these are divinely inspired texts, and that the Holy Spirit was involved in the writing and creation, but the history of them is very complicated, and certain faith traditions exclude certain books
Mm-hmm.
from what's canonical. There are these apocryphal texts that some for whatever reason have been included or excluded. It's a fascinating history. And so, of course, all of the answers,
All of them, every one of them.
every single one about are here. Omar, I don't know if you want to come back and do any kind of particular sign off, but I'll let you speak.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was an amazing conversation. For those of us who are history nerds and those of you out there who are biblical studies nerds like Eric. Thank you all so much for joining us. I dropped in a few links in the chat, so please open those up before we close out the program. We will have this program up tomorrow on our YouTube channel, and you could rewatch it there and share it with your friends and family. Start a nice conversation with your family about biblical history. And you can also see all of our upcoming events. We will be adding some more upcoming events very soon, right, Jacques?
Yes.
Stuff that's happening in January and February. And of course, link to Eric's book. Please purchase it. Yeah, we'll have a few more virtual events before the end of the year. We're going to have the third reconstruction with Peniel Joseph this Thursday. We're going to have a Clemens conversation on decking the halls and trimming the tree on December 19th. And another author talk called I'll Take New Haven on December 20th. And then we won't have any author programs for a couple of weeks until January 6th, when we will have a in-person program that has not been announced yet, but it will soon. Thank you all again very much. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jacques. Have a great evening.
Thank y'all. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.